Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if it seems like I'm looking to the side, it's because I am, but I'll try to pay attention to you as well. If you have questions during the presentation, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. And as Scott or Chris mentioned, we'll sort of monitor that. You can also raise your hand. And if you're one of the tiles that I see, I can hopefully see you, but we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So we'll cover a lot of information to hopefully set the stage, and then really looking forward to the discussion today. So as Glenn mentioned, we're really excited about this project, and we've partnered with a consultant team led by Stantec. They're an international consulting firm that does myriad things, all the way from land planning, urban design, stormwater and transportation, to construction and engineering. So we have a really great team put together. And then obviously we have city folks that are working with us as well. Glenn, Tony, and I are the lucky ones that get to present to you today. As Glenn mentioned, we started this project last year. As you know, Council has been really interested in the STEAM area for a couple of years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. We also know there's been tremendous interest in the Sugar Mill area for, as long as I've been in Longmont, and I'm sure before that, frankly, probably for the last 100 years, if we're honest. So we really are excited about developing a more detailed sub-area plan for this 250-acre site. It is important to know, and obviously this isn't going to be a surprise to any of you, this is a pretty diverse area, right? It's large, it's different, it has different character depending on where you are within the study area. And so while this is one study area for our planning purpose, we fully recognize that there are, sub areas or probably distinct character areas that we'll identify. So our recommendations are not likely going to be one size fits all, but there are some things that we feel like it's really important to look at from a study area perspective. For example, connectivity and transportation. So just to kind of set the stage and let you know, we are aware that there's some different characteristics within this larger area. The focus of this study is really, as Glenn mentioned, to look at some of those opportunities and challenges at a high level, to think about the urban design and character placemaking opportunities within these various parts of the study area. Multimodal connections are going to be huge. We need to figure out how we're connecting this area both within itself and to the larger Longmont and region. And then, as Glenn mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at infrastructure, utilities, and what some of those needs are, and what types of public and private investment might be appropriate to help support the types of redevelopment that we know there's interest in this area for. We've developed some high-level goals, basically based on some of the work that's been done to date and in talking with council and the community at large. And so we've developed these 5 goals to help guide our work. Obviously, housing is incredibly important to Longmont, and that's something that I know you all are aware of, and many of you working in your day-to-day jobs to think about housing in Longmont. And so this sub area is really an opportunity for us to think about how we can encourage meaningful housing options, a diverse suite of housing options, both in terms of types, but also in terms of price points, thinking about affordable and attainable housing, also thinking about different housing tenure. So how can we provide rental and ownership opportunities? We know that's something council's really interested in. I mentioned transportation and connectivity already, but we think this is a real opportunity to provide regional and local transportation connections. Obviously, you all know Longmont well. This is really in the center of the city. And so how can we make sure that we're connecting this area within the study area and beyond? From a development perspective, Tony and Glenn both mentioned that there's been development interest. There's a lot of development around this area, and you'll see that here in just a second. But we want to ensure that there's connectivity and coordinated planning between parcels as we go forward and between the broader Longmont community. We also know that there's a lot of interest in arts and culture, innovation, creativity, and I'm happy to see some folks from LPI on the call today. This continues to be a conversation that council and the community are really interested in. And so we want to see what types of things can this sub-area plan look at to help support those efforts. And then finally, sustainability continues to be something that's really important to the Longmont community. And so we want to really think about setting this sub-area plan up so that we are focused on sustainable building and development practices, and really how this area can become a model for sustainable development going forward. It's important to note that there's a lot of existing planning guidance in this sub area, and you can see some of that here. The reason that I mention this and like to spend a little time on this is because we're not starting from scratch. There's folks that have come before us that have taken a look at some of these things, some in more detailed ways, like the Arts and Event Center feasibility study that many of you were involved in. Also, the Urban Land Institute did a technical advisory panel. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, council in the city worked with many of you on the STEAM visioning process a couple of years ago, pre-COVID. And then there's a number of other plans, from the Main Street Corridor Plan to Envision Longmont to the First and Main Revitalization Plan, that are helping to inform this effort. It's also important to know that all of those planning processes did extensive community engagement. And so we're not starting from square one here. We know a lot of what the community is thinking about. We certainly want to verify, and we'll talk about our outreach efforts, but we do have a lot of great information that we can draw on. I'm going to talk a little bit more about two of the efforts that are really informing what we're doing. And the first is the Urban Land Institute TAP that we did in 2020. This was something that the city partnered with the Urban Land Institute on to bring development professionals from around the state to offer their expertise in solutions to develop some recommendations for the sugar mill site in general. And so this was a smaller stud area, about 120 acres, and really focused more on the sugar mill. So kind of that eastern portion of the site. If you haven't read this study, it's really interesting. They had a lot of great recommendations. And when we finish the presentation, I'll drop a link to the full study in the chat so you can take a look. But you can see the panel made recommendations in 5 areas. Thinking about, obviously, the cleanup and site remediation that's going to need to take place. We have some strategies on that, and Tony can talk more about that. Master planning the site, which is what we're doing now. We're acting on that recommendation to develop a more detailed sub-area plan. Thinking about the history of agriculture and the opportunity for maybe creating an agri-hub, building on the sustainable things that Longmont's done, building on our agricultural history, and really thinking about, from an economic and community development perspective, how could we embrace that? I mentioned sustainable community several times. And then finally, financial strategies. What types of, this is going to cost money. So what types of things might we want to think about in terms of supporting this redevelopment effort? You can see some of the key takeaways here. And there are some challenges that we're hoping to address through this sub-area planning effort, but I would encourage you to take a look at this report if you're interested in more details. As I mentioned, we also had a community engagement led by City Council, and I see Councilmember Waters is on the call today, so he can definitely probably do this slide justice more than I can, but I'll try. We convened an advisory panel that met over the course of 3 meetings. As part of that, we developed some high-level visioning in terms of placemaking. So did some massing and building designs and thought about what could this area be. And when I'm talking about the STEAM area, I'm sort of talking about that western portion of our study area. When we met with the community and council, that study area was a little bit different, but really when we talk about this, we're talking about the western portion. We asked some questions during this visioning and came up with 7 narratives, and you can see some of the outcomes of those here. And so those were really in the area of transportation and connectivity, building types and design, economic development and business support, overall land use and sort of placemaking. Obviously, arts and culture was a huge part of that. Thinking about the natural environment and low impact design, environmental protection, and obviously education was a big part of that as well. And all of this body of work is on Engage Longmont. And so you can take a look at the full narratives. The groups did a pretty extensive body of work here. And so there's some great information there as well. So kind of shifting to the current effort, I'd like to start with this context slide to just let you know, this sort of supports what Glenn was talking about. There's a lot of interest in this area, and Tony mentioned he can talk more about the specific development interest, but what you can see here is sort of what's going on in and around the study area, and all the parcels that are lit up as kind of this orange red have some sort of current development application on them. Obviously, not all of these are part of our sub-area plan, but some of these are acting as catalysts and really creating interest in the sub-area, which is why the time was right to do this plan. And so you can see a range of mixed-use projects. You can see a lot of residential projects, and then you can see some commercial projects, certainly with the hospital, with the Costco that's been in front of council. So this is really important to think about as we think about the development opportunities and redevelopment opportunities within the sub-area. Also want to mention that within the sub area in the eastern portion of the site, we have had some pre-application meetings and neighborhood meetings with folks that are wanting to redevelop the sugar mill. We've got a couple development groups that are working on putting something together. We've also have a multifamily developer that's working on a project directly east of the sugar mill. And so there are projects obviously on the east side, and you can see the ones that are on the west side that are already underway. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I know there's many real estate professionals on this call. We are looking at land ownership. Obviously, we need to involve the property owners as well as development interests in this effort. You can see there's a lot of property owners in this study area. There's over 60 property owners. And certainly on the western portion of the study area, there's a lot of small property owners. On the eastern side and sort of in the southern portion of STEAM, there's some larger properties that have been assembled. And so we've been meeting with folks. We did send a letter to all property owners, and we convened a couple development meetings to really talk about what people's visions are, what their plans are for their property, and how can this sub area plan inform that. And one of the things that we've heard is helping to tackle sort of those infrastructure, utility, thinking about what the city really wants to see, what the community really wants to see. And so that's one of the things we're focused on. From a zoning perspective, I always like to include this slide because I'm a planner and I like zoning. A lot of this area is in the city and zoned mixed use downtown or mixed use employment, which provides a lot of opportunity for a great variety of uses, all the way from residential to retail to more employment oriented uses. But it's important to note that a good portion of this site is not actually within the city yet. So the whole area is within our planning area. We anticipate that someday it will annex to the city. But the sugar mill site, the area to the south that's currently being used as storage, has not yet been annexed. And so, as I mentioned, we've met with some development interests that are thinking about how they present their annexation to council. But important to know that the whole area is not yet within the city. We're looking at opportunities for connections to the open space system that exists. And you can see from this map, there's some really tremendous opportunities here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. To the south of the site, obviously, the St. Vrain Creek runs south of this area. And there's a great network of trails and city-owned open space. And also, the recently completed Dickens Farm Nature Area. So this provides a lot of opportunity as we think about what those complementary uses are, as we think about how we tie into the system, and as we think about how we augment the open space system going forward. We're also, as I've mentioned several times, really interested in connectivity. And so this is a street map, but really what I want to talk about is we'll be looking at all modes in this plan. And so you can see here, there's pretty good connectivity on the western portion of the study area, although south of First, we do really need to think about what those connections to the broader downtown look like. You can see connectivity in terms of roadways is a little bit more limited on the eastern side. There are some street connections, but we really need to think about as this area redevelops and intensifies, densifies, we need to provide options for folks to move in and around the site. And so we're looking at vehicle travel, which is really what you see here, our streets, signalized intersections. We're also looking at trails. We've got a lot of great trails to the south and some on-street, a pretty robust on-street trail network for bicyclists and pedestrians to the north. But there are some boundaries, physical or perceived boundaries. And so how do we sort of address that? Similarly with transit, we have pretty good transit on the west side of the study area. And certainly that'll continue to be more robust as time goes on with the bus rapid transit and eventual rail that will hook up at First and Main, which I know many of you have been involved in those conversations. But we also want to think about how we pull transit into the eastern portion of the study area because it's really non-existent at this point. So shifting to talk a little bit about opportunities and challenges, you can sense our excitement. We know the community's excited and there are a lot of incredible opportunities. And so I've already talked about how we're building on prior work. We think that's a real strength of this sub-area plan. We're able to mine what we've heard. We're able to look at a lot of existing data. We also are excited because this is a gateway to Longmont, right? For those of us who have been in Longmont for a long time and come in from the east, this is really our very first impression of Longmont as we enter. town. So there's a lot of opportunities for visual entry features to sort of augment what we already have with the public art piece at 3rd and Kemprat. Also some incredible historic preservation efforts and possibilities with the sugar mill itself, right? That's an iconic building. We've heard from the community that there's a lot of interest in adaptive reuse and preservation. There's some interest in the perspective from the prospective developer in terms of adaptive reuse and preservation. So we think this is an incredible opportunity. Also an opportunity from a gateway perspective as a entry to downtown, right? As you're coming up from Main Street, this is really the southern entry to downtown. And so that's another gateway opportunity. I've mentioned housing. I don't think we can overstate how important the conversation on housing is to Longmont right now. And we really see this as an opportunity to continue to diversify our housing stock. And so we're really looking at how could we meaningfully include some missing middle options? What are folks wanting to do? And I'll share some information on our preliminary market study that's really going to help inform this work as well. But we think this is a real opportunity. I mentioned open space, a lot of great open space connectivity, trail access. The Greenway runs just to the south of the site. And so what opportunities do we have to connect to the creek, to connect to the Greenway system, to connect to the existing open space that's there? We also know that there's areas within and adjacent to this study area that are going to be mined and reclaimed. And so that provides additional opportunities for new open space in the study area and potentially helps us look at how we can provide access to green space for future residents and non-residential users. And then we think there's an opportunity to look at some pilot projects, look at some best practices. Our consultant team has taken a look at 3rd Avenue and has contemplated, how might that be re-envisioned as more of a complete street? Right now, it's sort of acting a little bit as a barrier in terms of connectivity to those northern neighborhoods. So how might we re-envision that? We are taking a look at green infrastructure and site-wide opportunities for low-impact development. Obviously, any development needs to meet water quality, stormwater. So how can we really think about that on a larger scale and potentially incorporate that into some placemaking strategies? And then finally, I've mentioned a couple of times, there's so much interest in culture, creativity, innovation. How can we think about this as a cultural hub? Build on the existing assets in place in STEAM. Also think about how we complement all the great work that's going on in downtown currently, as well as even other locations like the Quail campus where the museum is. And so thinking about how we're creating the system, how we're creating opportunities for complementary uses. Opportunities need to be balanced with a conversation on challenges, and this study area is not lacking in its challenges. Obviously, we've mentioned a couple times the access. There's limited signalized intersections, which are a great way to help control flow. So we need to take a look at that. We've always thought on our comp plan that Pace Street would be extended through this sub area. But as we really get into that and look at some of the grade challenges that exist, and for those of you who have been out to that eastern portion of the study area, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It probably doesn't make sense for this roadway to be an arterial roadway that connects. And so what are some other options for that? There's some safety challenges with East Kemprat Boulevard, highway or north of 119th Street, which is Pace Street, 3rd Avenue. So especially for pedestrians and bicyclists, how are some ways we can help enhance safety? And then obviously just connecting within the study area. So we know there's challenges to connect broader, but we also know there's some challenges to connect within. There's railroad tracks, there's a wastewater treatment plant. And so how are we going to address some of that? I just mentioned railroads. There are railroads in the area. We all know how exciting it can be to work with the railroads. And so one of the things that we're looking at is, what is the railroad comfortable with in terms of changes to the configuration? Is there the ability to maybe straighten some of the tracks out to maybe create better crossings, or does that then become a whole relocation, which has its own challenges? So taking a look at railroad opportunities. And then there are a lot of opportunities with open space and river access, but there's also some constraints. There's a rail line that provides a boundary that's challenging to cross. There's different uses that provide a challenge. And so how can we think about ways to get people from the steam area, the sugar mill area, and frankly, north of Longmont to connect and access the amenities that are there? And then last, but certainly not least, we know there's environmental challenges here. Tony can talk more about this if you have specific questions, but we've been working with the state, with the property owners and potential developers. The phase 2 sampling is complete and they're working on that final report. Tony has been working with Stantec, our consultant, on submitting a grant for brownfields cleanup to help plan the cleanup. And so that work is ongoing, obviously. And then there's some floodplain issues. Obviously, we've been working on the Resilient St. Vrain project, which will vastly improve our floodplain issues, but all of that work is not yet complete. And so there are still some properties, particularly within the western portion of the study area, that have some encumbrances due to floodplain. And so as we talk with prospective developers and property owners, this is first and foremost in their mind because it does create some uncertainty around timing and some additional challenges to work through. So that's something that we're obviously aware of as well. I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about some of the market findings. Part of our RFP and part of our consultant team was to work with Civistruct to update the office and industrial study that was recently done, I think commissioned by the DDA and LEDP, but also to do a more robust residential market snapshot. And so we have that information. I'd be happy to share it with you all. But some of what is informing us are these main trends that we're seeing. We've been talking about demographic shifts for some time now. We know that Longmont, like the rest of the state and frankly the nation, has an increasing number of aging households. We also have an increasing number of non-traditional households, so households without children. And this is a significant driver of our future housing stock. Obviously, Longmont has a lot of single-family detached homes. We've seen quite a bit of multifamily product built over the past 5 years, but we know that these demographic changes are bringing additional opportunities for diversified housing. So that could be this missing middle housing that all of us have been talking about. We know that people are really interested in placemaking and walkability, maintenance-free living. And so there's really an opportunity to think about this. And I'll say this is also a great opportunity for us to think about not only affordable in the traditional sense, but workforce and attainable housing as well. This may be surprising to folks. I know it seems like we're growing a lot. There's a lot of new building, but growth is slowing down. And this is, again, a statewide trend, national trend. We're forecasting that growth will continue to go down. We have the lowest birth rates we've had in a number of years. Net migration is at its lowest levels ever. And because of the aging that we're seeing, we're also seeing an increased death rate. And so that will continue to impact us as we move forward. The pandemic is always looming. It's still, Scott mentioned having to reschedule an after hours event. I think more broadly, there's still some different outlooks on how the pandemic will continue to impact us. Some sectors, such as industrial and multifamily, have really not seemed to have been impacted quite as much, but certainly the outlook for retail and office is a little bit more unknown. It seems like there's a great reset going on, and I think we're not entirely certain what that means for development and real estate. And that really leads into the next point of sort of this work anywhere, live anywhere opportunity that the pandemic has shown us. It actually sets up Longmont pretty well. You may have heard the rise of the mid-sized cities like Longmont that have great downtowns, that have a lot of open space and amenities, are really places where people want to be. And so this may help us attract residents. But again, it also may impact our future for office market if people are not needing to be in person quite as much. So the big takeaway is that flexibility and convenience need to be first and foremost. That's really going to drive everything in terms of working, living, recreating, shopping. And so needing to think about that in terms of our land planning efforts. As you know, from working with the planning department, any good planning process is really built on solid community and stakeholder engagement. And this is no different. While we are using a lot of the feedback that we've collected through those previous planning efforts I mentioned, we do still want to confirm that those assumptions are correct. We want to make sure that we're understanding the current community's needs and interests, and also build off the efforts that are underway in terms of specific development projects. So we're working to engage stakeholders, and we really want to do this in an inclusive way to incorporate all community voices. So we're going to use this to help shape our recommendations, to help shape the final plan. it's a little harder, frankly, during COVID because we're all, on screens versus being in a room where we can chat. But hopefully we'll have some opportunities for in-person engagement. We're really excited to be able to partner with Growing Up Boulder to do some youth engagement. And so that will kick off in the next several weeks, where we're going to engage a number of third grade classes to really help them learn about this sub-area plan, help them offer some input, because frankly, any long range plan, they're in a really important stakeholder in that. We're also hoping to do a community meeting in early March. It will likely be virtual, just because, again, of the unknowns, but I'll ask Scott to let all of you know when we've solidified that date. So that'll be hopefully to take a look at some early alternatives, to provide some additional feedback in some of those topic areas that we mentioned. So I'll make sure to keep you included on that. We have an online presence. If you haven't gone out already, please visit our Engage Longmont site. We're sharing project information there. You can ask questions. You can engage with us that way. This group, I think almost everyone on here knows how to get a hold of me, and now you can get a hold of Glenn and Tony as well. But we're always happy to chat with you if you have ideas or questions. And then what I'll close with, this is sort of our preview of a recent survey we just closed earlier this week and have some initial data to share with you all. So you get to see this first, frankly, even before City Council, except for Tim that I see on the call. We conducted a community-wide survey through our Engage Longmont portal. And we asked folks about those high-level project goals, and then asked them to share any additional feedback they have. So I'll go through some of what we've heard. We did get over 250 responses, and it seems like a pretty diverse set of responses. So we're pleased with that. We're still mining this data, so I don't have all the answers yet, but I'll be able to share some initial thoughts with you. So we asked folks what type of housing they thought was most appropriate in this study area. And as you can see here, the majority of respondents thought that townhomes were appropriate, followed by condos and apartments. Senior housing and tiny homes came in a little bit lower. We didn't ask folks, if you're looking at the numbers and wondering how these percentages add up, we didn't ask folks to limit themselves. And so they were able to select any housing type that they thought would apply. I'll mention that in some of the other responses, you can see that we got over 50 other responses. Some folks wanted to see smaller single family detached. So that may be something we take a look at, although that our current land use doesn't really contemplate that. Other folks really didn't want to see any more growth. And so while as a planner that's thinking about our growth rates and thinking about how we're changing as a community, probably not realistic to think that we won't continue to grow, but some people did have that sentiment. And so we'll be mining through those results in the coming weeks. We also asked folks about how we could connect the site regionally and how we could connect the site more locally. And this was a ranked question. And so you can see from a regional perspective, people still really want to see a train. And so hopefully we're still moving forward on that. People also are interested in seeing HOV connections, potentially along 119, connections to BRT, looking at car share, buses, and then bike connections as well. As we think about more local connectivity, the priorities are a little bit different. Shared mobility, so this could be car share, this could be scooters, this could be bike share, things like that. Thinking about additional connections for vehicles, thinking about public transit, and obviously this is something we're talking about as well. And then bike and pedestrian connections too. We asked how people envision this area really being what's most appropriate for a cultural hub as we think about arts, culture, creativity, and innovation. And so you can see this was another one where we didn't ask people to limit themselves. They could choose whatever they wanted. You can see that a very high percentage of people really saw this as a good area for a live music venue, followed by performing arts, arts galleries, interactive education or learning experiences, multicultural centers, makerspace, conference and research center, and then potentially supplements to a museum. We haven't gone through all the other responses, but I'm sure there'll be some fascinating information there too that we'll be able to report out on. And then finally, we asked, what does sustainability mean as it relates to development of the site? So what should we really consider? And this was another ranking question. And so the highest percentage of folks thought resource allocation, thinking about adaptive reuse, sort of recycling, composting, zero waste type items, water reduction and conservation, green building was most important, followed by quality of life considerations. So again, we see preservation popping up here, creating community, so placemaking, improving equitable access to housing. I think we're seeing, again, workforce and affordable housing. Third was natural world. So thinking about the environment, mobility, thinking about bike and ped connectivity, micro mobility, so like scooters, last mile solutions, transit, EV, land use. So thinking about smart growth, potentially mixed use, more densified development, thinking about how we incorporate urban ag. And again, we see adaptive reuse here. And then last but not least, and I should mention, these were all pretty close. It wasn't a huge deviation from 1 to 6 here. Climate and risk. So thinking about how do we continue to reduce emissions? How do we continue to plan for being adaptable and resilient in the face of disasters? So with that, I know that was a ton of information. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast, which I often do. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can go through questions. I don't know, Chris, if you want me to just call on people if they have questions, or if you want to facilitate that. It doesn't look like we have a number of questions in the chat. We don't have any questions in the chat, so we'll let people come on camera and ask.
Yeah, that's my observation as well. One thing before we start a Q&A period is I want to emphasize that I want to end this section of our program this morning in about 18 minutes at 9 a.m. so we can get on to the legislative update, which is our primary focus as a public policy committee. So for those who have questions, just jump right in here. I don't see any, as Erin indicated, I don't see anything on the chat room. So if you have questions and you want to share them, ask them verbally.
It looks like Daniel and Rick both have questions. Daniel, do you want to go, and then we'll go to Rick?
Sure. Just in terms of the development of this area, is there any consideration or thought regarding some form of additional bypass for the train lines, whether that be underground or a bridge or something like that? I know that we have access going out to the end of 3rd on the east end there, and there's access over, we know where it is over there off of 2nd. But just out of curiosity, I know that the train, particularly BNSF, likes to park in this area to some extent. Across Martin Street is one particular example, sometimes across Main Street. But is there any consideration of increasing the ability to transit through that as this area goes through the proposal development?
Yeah, Daniel, that's a good question. We haven't gotten to specific recommendations at this point. Obviously, we understand that the railroad poses some challenges both to future redevelopment as well as, frankly, to our existing lives. But, I wish I had Phil here, our transportation planner, to kind of talk about that. Some of the things that you mentioned in terms of underground and overhead are super costly and would require a lot of space. So I don't know if those would be feasible for sure. But I think what we'll look at are some solutions that we can work within the city confines and then potentially within the railroad. But we haven't developed any of those specific recommendations at this point.
Thank you.
Rick?
Erin, in your discussions about housing and affordability and attainability, has there been any discussion about public-private partnerships, or is this more of a general discussion?
I think it's both. And I'll invite Tony to weigh in here to talk a little bit more about some of the work he's been engaged on. But certainly, I think we recognize as the city that a challenge as big as housing is probably going to require some type of public-private partnership. And so similarly to my answer to Daniel, we haven't gotten to the specific recommendations yet, but certainly the city is interested in seeing how we partner and support any efforts to provide housing, particularly affordable and attainable housing. Tony, do you want to weigh in a little bit on some of the conversations you've been having around the city's role in supporting future redevelopment, including housing?
Yeah, so as it relates to this particular planning endeavor and the associated development, both in the STEAM area and in the sugar mill area, it will definitely require some level of a public-private partnership across the board. First, to remediate and preserve and reuse those existing historic buildings, the development because the area is devoid of any significant infrastructure. There's going to be excessive costs there. And that's actually where the role of the Urban Renewal Authority comes into play, because the Urban Renewal Authority would have access to financial resources that the city would not have access to. That could be used to reinvest and leverage some of that private investment. And hopefully what we would do is look to see how the Urban Renewal Authority can be part of that investment that helps bring down some of the development related costs that allow then those cost savings to be passed on to some of the housing. So it definitely will require some kind of public-private partnership. We don't know what role the city would have in that public-private partnership at this time, but we expect they would have a more minimal role of some type too.
And I see, thank you, Tony. I see that Kathy has a question. Are all the owners interested in participating, and what's the process and timeline for annexation? So I don't know if all the owners are interested, but we have had conversations with most of the larger property owners, as well as interested developers. And I think they are participating in our conversation. So hopefully that will continue. I certainly don't want to speak for them, but our indication at this point is yes, people want to participate in this process. In terms of the process and timeline for annexation, we have had a pre-application meeting with folks to outline what the process is with them. The next step for them would really be to go to city council for an annexation referral. And that's a chance for council to sort of look at the overall concept and say, yes or no, we want you to pursue formal annexation. And so I think that's something that the property owners and interested developers could do at any time. Now, I'm not certain what their timeline is, but definitely that would be the first step. And then if council refers the property, which, it's in our planning area, I'm sure council will have questions, but if they were to refer it, then they would start the process for annexation. And that's a development review process. We would have obviously the public required components, the required DRC review, and then ultimately that annexation would go to Planning Commission for a recommendation and then City Council for final approval. And then let's see, I see a comment from Kate. Thanks for considering the workforce and our future workforce. Housing, yeah, we're excited about that opportunity too, Kate. And if you have specific things we should be thinking about, certainly feel free to reach out and let us know. Rick, do you have another question, or is your hand still raised?
My hand's still raised.
Okay.
I don't have another question, Erin. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, we appreciate the comments. I see another comment in here. I think that's actually just to me, so I will look at that separately. I think, Chris, we're right on schedule for you to get to your legislative update. I would just say, if you come up with another question, again, we're here. You know where to reach us, either virtually or in person some days. Feel free to reach out to us. Check out our Engage Longmont site. I'll drop the link in the chat here, and then I'll also put a link to the TAP report that I mentioned. And we really appreciate you having us today and working with us on this project.